the difference between theory and criticism, like what really is, maybe even using Frankenstein, since that's in your text, as an example. What's, different about learning literary theory and then actually applying it to a text like Frankenstein?
Yeah, for me, the difference between theory and criticism, and this is not everyone's kind of way of making this distinction, but for me, theory is kind of a set of principles or a framework, or kind of what you bring to a text. And criticism is kind of how you put those principles and put that framework into action. So how you read a text. And the two are very interrelated.
Hi, welcome to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I'm really excited. This is another Broadview Press special podcast episode. Today, actually, I'm joined with people from our community who know her. Ceren Usta is co-hosting with me. Hi, Ceren.
Hello, Andrew. It's nice
So excited
to be
for
here.
her to be here. So good. And today we're going to be talking all things literary theory and criticism, but please don't stop listening. We're going to break through the wall of literary theory, I promise you, because we are joined by the author of the new second edition of Literary Theory and Criticism, Anne H. Stevens. And I just want to introduce Anne formally before she comes on. So Anne is actually now recently the Dean of the College of Letters and Science at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. She specializes in the 18th century with literature, the history of the novel, literary theory, of course. She's published 3 books, including the one we're going to talk about. And she actually does have a New York City connection. She got her master's and doctoral degree from NYU. So New York is always in the atmosphere here. So Anne, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. This is my first ever time being on a podcast, so it's exciting.
Yay!
We welcome you. Wonderful. Okay. Well, I think I'm going to give Ceren the first question, just because Ceren and I were already, she has the first edition of your book. I have the second in print, even though, thank you, Broadview, for giving us the online edition. And we were just discussing a little of your intro, like how you bring about this discussion of literary theory to break that hesitancy around it. So, Ceren, you go for it.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Andrew. I think, as I was saying earlier, even in your introduction from the very first sentence, there is this feeling, this message of making criticism and theory more accessible, even to the non-academically oriented reader and just general audience. So the way that you approach interpretation, criticism as like an everyday activity, and the examples that you provide in that very intros, this is actually something that we do on a daily basis. We just, when we put it in that, capital letter, theory and criticism, it becomes a little bit more scary. So I really like that connection you're making between how, criticism, theory, this is actually something that's based in everyday activities, and it's something we are as social beings that we do engage in. So I think then my first question to you would be, how what can we learn from literary and critical theory that ends up being taught at introductory courses, whether in like undergrad level or maybe grad level, but I'm thinking mostly undergraduate. And we talk about Plato, Aristotle, or the Renaissance, early modern period, and the tendency for most students, this is, so from so far away, like this was so long ago. Why do I need to engage with this? Why do I need to learn this, right? So what can we learn from literary and critical theory from such periods that seem so outdated and so far away, so disconnected from our current reality, to actually apply to our current, struggles or, situations? How would you explain that?
Sure. Thank you for that. I will, before answering the question, just give you a little bit of context for the book, which is not to be found anywhere in the book, but helps to kind of make sense of like where I was coming from in writing this. So in 2014, I was contacted by an acquisitions editor from John Wiley and Sons. And it was the series that you probably have heard of, the For Dummies books.
Yes.
And they had a series of dummies books that covered academic topics. And they wanted to do a literary theory and criticism for dummies. And because I published in this area and because my course syllabi were online, they sort of invited me to submit a proposal. John Wiley and Sons then, that portion of the company went bankrupt after I had already put together kind of a very detailed proposal and gotten an advance and everything. So then I had this project that I had to find a new home for, because I didn't want to give it up, because I thought it was a really good idea to have a book that was introducing people to this field, which can seem very daunting, but make it as accessible as possible. And there's other titles in that series like Neuroscience for Dummies, things that seem really complicated, but like breaking it down very simply. So luckily I was able to find a new home for the project with Broadview, and kind of retooled it, made it a little more academic and a little more kind of designed for a classroom, but very much the kind of spirit of the project from its initial inception was really to make things relevant and accessible. And so I do know that there are a lot of people who use the book in undergraduate courses, or portions of the book in undergraduate courses, in like an intro to literature course or a intro to theory course. And I've had students tell me that they like that it's really accessible. But in terms of the early period, the Plato, Aristotle, Middle Ages kind of stuff, one of the reasons that I wrote the book the way I did is that's the way I teach. When I teach the Intro to Theory course at my previous institution, it was Intro to Literary Theory and Criticism. It was required for all English majors. And we used the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism. And we began with Plato and Aristotle and Longinus. And so I structured the book sort of the way I teach the class. But one of the things that I always found in teaching that course, which I taught for 17 years, now I'm a dean, I don't teach anymore, so I sort of miss it, or at least for now, I don't teach. But some of the questions that come up in the very early days of the course, when we're doing the ancient writers, are the questions that really remain central to literary studies throughout this entire long history. So, and that's something I try to emphasize in the book, that these questions can take new forms, but they really go all the way back. So the first reading that when I taught the course, the first reading we would do was selections from Plato's Republic. And Plato is talking about kind of the ethics of representation. And if you think about debates in literary studies today, they very much still center on the ethics of representation. You know, what is appropriate to be presented? Can literature, shape people's attitudes and behaviors? If you're thinking about, reading literature from earlier periods of time that invokes sexist or racist stereotypes, and instructors grappling with that, should we read these texts from earlier periods that have these really outdated attitudes.
Mhm.
There's very much what Plato's talking about. We want to protect people from, bad ideas. And it always, Plato, he's very pro censorship. And it always provoked a really, really lively discussion in the class about,
Mhm.
everyone believes in free speech, but then there's limits to free speech. And so some of
Yeah.
those things are very, very relevant, I think, going all the way through when talking about Aristotle and Aristotle's poetics. Also gets into some of the same questions of representation, but also the thinking about the relationship of form and content and how stories are structured, and how for Aristotle and for other writers, other ancient theorists like Longinus, fiction becomes this really powerful tool for understanding the world, for creating empathy. And for Aristotle, fiction is even superior to nonfiction in terms of thinking about, shaping the world through that act of catharsis and being able to tell a story that will be powerful and compelling. And again, I think that relates to contemporary discussions about literature. Why is it important? Why is literature remain a vital subject? How can literature engage people with questions of social justice, with questions of, environmental justice? Those things, those debates go all the way back to these kind of early theorists. So that's my kind of long-winded answer of, and also thinking about the way the book was structured. The other books kind of out there that introduce literary theory to a kind of more general or a student audience tend to not go all the way back. They tend to mostly just be 20th and 21st century, and they tend to also not be very synthetic. So they tend to just, here's a school, here's a chapter on deconstruction, here's a chapter on psychoanalysis, here's a chapter on,
Gender, like feminist theory. Yeah. Mhm.
right.
Queer
So that
theory,
theory
yeah.
becomes just a series of isms, like, are you this or are you that? Which hat are you wearing?
Yeah.
But the history is actually much more interrelated. So I tried to, I
Right.
had to do some breaking it down when you get into the 20th century, because otherwise the 20th century, 21st century would be, most of the book, really long chapters. So I said group things, but I wanted to show, because most people don't just identify as one thing as a reader or a critic. You can be a feminist who's also really interested in narrative, who's also really interested in ecological issues, whatever the case may be. People don't tend to just use one lens exclusively.
Absolutely.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was such a comprehensive and
Mhm.
very, comprehensive and concise at the same time. I think you just captured everything beautifully. And
Yes.
this connection that you are pointing out between all these different schools of thoughts and the history, and how it's easier to kind of exclude the earlier periods because it is a lot more tricky to maybe get the contemporary readers' attention or students' attention to think about those things. But the things that we are thinking about and grappling with today are, were relevant for people back then as they are for us in just different forms. So there's this connection of humanity has been dealing with these issues for a long time, So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, yeah. And if I may, for everyone out there, I want them to hear just the opening of your intro, because I think it's so important. And because Ceren, brought us there, which is that you really start with the everyday signs in our life. So, the first sentence is, every day we perform countless acts of reading, writing, interpretation, and evaluation. We read signs, write emails, interpret others' behavior, evaluate our lunch options, or just click like on a piece of writing or a photo online. So at its most basic level, literary theory provides an opportunity to slow down and to reflect upon these activities. I just love that opening, Anne, because it's what I've been speaking with Ceren about, why I love your book so much is because of what you've described. I love that you outline this history of literary theory. Like your book wasn't around when I was an undergrad for literary theory. And I really like Charles Bressler's book. That's the one I was assigned on literary theory. But it was more of, I'm going to just like go quickly through the history to get us to the 21st century angles or lenses. I mean, when I think of literary theory, I can never not remember my undergrad professor, shout out because she listens, Jan Balakian. So Jan would always kind of compare literary theory to when you go for an eye exam and that machine where they flip down every lens to see what matches with your prescription. And I always think, oh, that makes sense. Like what is kind of standing out to you when you're reading a book? And but it comes from the primary source first, and then you add in the theory. And like, what are you compelled towards? And what I'm really curious is there must be so much that goes through your mind. I think creating a book like this, I would be nervous. Like if you had tasked me with creating a literary theory book, I would be like, where do I begin? So can you you said you taught the course 17 years. So like, what did you know you needed in the book? And what did you think, okay, this might really obscure the message?
Definitely. I think that in terms of what I felt I needed, beyond the kind of historical survey, I definitely wanted to include that last chapter that walks through a couple examples of how you might apply. And I used just texts that are really, really commonly taught, Hamlet and Frankenstein. So I figured, probably, a lot of people have read those or are familiar with the storylines, at least from the many film adaptations. So I wanted to have some application, but also to make that application more synthetic. So not just say, here's an example of a feminist, a text that you could apply a feminist lens to, but kind of say you can apply these lenses, multiple lenses to the same text. So kind of run those examples through a lot of things. In terms of what I didn't feel was would be useful, there's a lot of jargon that goes into literary theory, a lot of terminology, and some of that's very much needed. You need to really use precise language if you're understanding some of these specialized schools of thought. But I didn't want to get overwhelmed with the jargon. So there was a glossary in the back of the book, but I really tried to, when I had to use a very specific jargony type word, tried to give an equivalent. Even in, in writing this book and having been, working in the field of literary theory and, having taught it for a long time, like, I don't know if I could have told you before writing this book what phenomenology was exactly. It's just one of those words. It's like so abstract. Like, I think I understand it, but wait, do I? And it's like, oh no, it's just the study of perception.
There you go.
And so then I just, that's all phenomenology is, but I don't know why it daunted me for so long. It's like, I don't understand, or like hermeneutics, like that also just seemed really confusing. It's just interpretation. So where possible, just kind of break things down to like make it a little less.
I love this game. We should keep going. Well, because another term I think we all hear all the time is epistemology.
Yes.
Right. And
just knowledge,
study of knowledge. Yeah. There we go.
I wish we had this interview before my comprehensive exam is all I can say right now.
We could just be like, Ceren would use her list and she'll just throw terms out and be like, oh, that's what it is.
It just would have helped with the immense anxiety. You're like, right, yes.
But I think this is a good point.
As simple as that. Yeah.
Like, why do you think that barrier might exist, Anne, is like more in the university? Like, and maybe this is where we're getting to. What I love is this is a public humanities podcast that so many out there who are readers, who enter their libraries or bookstores, would be curious about that understanding of phenomenology, about perception, right? What it's like to touch a book, what it's like to smell a book, like get involved with all their sensory, the sensory emotions. And but why do you think that barrier of language, like we start to question, wait, is that what it really means?
Well, some of it, there's no other word for it. Some of it's just gatekeeping, right? Just we have to, and this is something I talk about a little bit in the book, but that I can definitely sort of expand upon. Literary studies prior to the 20th century wasn't an academic discipline. It wasn't something you studied at a university. It was just something people did. They read, and people did study, wrote literary histories, wrote literary analyses, but it wasn't an academic discipline. But when kind of in the late 19th century, when the shape of the modern university kind of coalesced, and academic disciplines and scholarly societies are formed, there was this real immense pressure to have a kind of level of rigor for these fields. And so actually, and I talk about this a bit in the introduction, one of the things I found really interesting was looking through the back catalog of the journal PMLA, Publications of the Modern Language Association, which is one of the oldest, most established journals in the field of literary studies. And it goes all the way back to the 19th century. And talk about jargony. The articles from the late 19th century are the most jargony things I've ever seen, like much more so than literary studies today. But it was part of that, we're a scientific field. We have to have a scientific, we're publishing scientific papers. And so some of that still remains within literary studies, because if you don't have that kind of rigor, that gatekeeping, that scientific vocabulary, then it's just book club, right? It's just kids talking about books. And then why is it a subject for a university? So I feel like there is enough complexity within literary studies without all of the jargon. That is, there's still just the richness of literary expression and language and the many, many ways to interpret the world and all of the things that go into that without it having to be kind of have this quasi-scientific vocabulary kind of foregrounded to that extent. But I think that's part of the reason. I think also the close relationship of literary theory and philosophy, a discipline that is not known for its entry level kind of, accessibility for the entry level reader, and a lot of particularly the French and German theorists who shaped literary theory in the 60s and 70s, they were trained philosophers. So terms like hermeneutics and phenomenology, they come out of German and French philosophical traditions. So the thing that's interesting about literary studies is that it brings together so many different fields. You have this continental philosophy tradition, but you also have kind of, the tradition of book reviewing and things that are not tied to the academy, and it kind of brings those together. Again, another long-ish answer.
No, I'm so happy for your college, like, just to be frank with you, to like have that to have that perspective and to talk about gatekeeping in that way and to think of language. I can tell how passionate you are in just literacy, and that means so much for you to be the dean. So I just want to thank your university for hiring you. So
well, hopefully the college feels the same way.
I'm sure they will.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think this really brings me to the next question that I want to ask you, because now we're starting to talk about university and literary studies as a field emerging in this new institution in the 19th century. And, the history that you gave us makes so much sense, because we're talking about this, like the Enlightenment period, right? Everything is like, there's this specific fields are there, everything like is understood as it can be studied, it can be explained, everything like specialization is becoming more institutionalized, but a lot has actually changed since then. Some things haven't, but a lot
Just a few
has.
things.
So, as a field, as a literary field, in like humanities courses, literature courses, the university in our in contemporary period, what do you think is the role that's going to be assigned to such courses or such fields, or not role maybe, but the place that they're going to have going forward with the struggles that we have been seeing for some time now, but maybe they've become a lot more apparent since COVID when it comes to the institutional difficulties. What kind of place will be open for such studies and fields and discussions as we move forward? What do you make of that?
So is your question future of literary studies?
Yes.
Just an easy, simple question.
Yes.
Okay, hold on to that question because we'll be right back. But first, a word from our sponsor. The Ivory Tower Boiler Room is so happy to welcome Broadview Press as our official sponsor. Broadview Press is an independent academic publisher in the humanities that produces high-quality, pedagogically useful books for use in university and college classrooms. They publish in the humanities, mainly in English studies, writing, philosophy, and history. They always publish with an eye towards diversity, so there is a strong list of titles from women, people of color, and other authors from marginalized groups. In the summer of 2022, they launched their new Broadview anthology of American literature, which increases diversity in the classroom because it rethinks the American canon and breathes new life into the American Literary Survey. It's actually been called, quote, the new gold standard in the field. I love using Broadview Press text in my own classroom at Stony Brook University. I can't wait to use the new Anthology of American Literature when I have the opportunity. And for all of you out there, Broadview Press has given us the official code Ivory Tower for 20% off site-wide on broadviewpress.com. Again, that is code Ivory Tower for 20% off.
Your brain needs support, and new Ollie Brainy Chews are a delightful way to take care of your cognitive health. Made with scientifically backed ingredients like Thai ginger, L-theanine, and caffeine, Brainy Chews support healthy brain function and help you find your focus, stay chill, or get energized. Be kind to your mind and get these nootropic chews at ollie.com. That's OLLY.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Well, definitely a few things that I've seen that I think are positive. I mean, on the kind of the larger picture of kind of the traditional liberal arts fields, they are declining. The history major is declining. Number of English majors are declining. That's just a national trend. I don't think that's likely to change anytime soon. Students, because of the cost of higher education, there's a lot more focus on degrees that have a really clear career pathway at the end. So you'll still see plenty of people going into English who plan to do secondary education. For example, they want to teach English, so you study English or secondary education with a English emphasis. But the kind of pure liberal arts fields, like philosophy, like all of these areas, they're just on the decline, particularly at public institutions that serve, first generation students. Like my current institution and my previous institution was a minority serving institution. And it's hard to, if families are paying out of pocket for degrees, they want their students to major in something like nursing or engineering or business, where it's like very clear that there's a job at the end of it. And that's a shame, because then these fields like English and history and philosophy really become kind of the domain of the highly privileged, of people who aren't as concerned with, getting a career at the end of it, who can, who go to small selective liberal arts colleges or Ivy League schools, and who have that ability to just, follow their passions rather than being concerned about job readiness. So one of the things that that I think is helpful for literary studies is for, without losing the focus on language and interpretation, to really think about areas where courses and programs can be offered that provide students with a stronger sense of what they can do with the degree when they're on the other side. So professional writing is an area that's really been a growth area for English programs, and technical writing. But you can also imagine other types of things, like a lot of English majors go on to library work or publishing. So kind of building that into the curriculum a little bit more, so that students know kind of, getting some of that hands-on experience, working in, a library while taking classes, or other types of things like that. I also think a lot of what's exciting in literary studies right now is the growth of interdisciplinarity with cross-listed courses. A lot of the most popular literature courses that I've seen at various institutions are the ones that are cross-listed with, say, an ethnic studies program or a gender studies program, where you're studying these issues in relation to, literature. So rather than just a straight, gender studies course, using literature as a lens to understand gender and sexuality, or to understand, the African-American experience. I think that's an area where there's a lot of growth. I think, literature and writing are so intertwined, and writing is never going to stop being an important part of college curriculum. So English departments are never going away, but I think for English departments to really think about kind of how to reframe their curriculum so that it's more interdisciplinary, so that it's more responsive to kind of career pressures that students are facing, that it's more kind of focused on writing skills and different types of different modalities of writing, writing for the web, writing for, in other types of contexts, that will help English departments to survive. I mean, some of my most beloved classes that I've taught over the years, like one time, because of a faculty need, is not my area of expertise at all, but I taught a whole semester course on Milton, where we spent, 7-8 weeks reading Paradise Lost. I don't think I'll ever teach that course again. Like, those kind of courses are probably never going to be, the same as they once were back in the 60s. But I'll still always find a way to teach some Milton in some other class, whether it's, talking about kind of literature and revolution, or, whatever the case may be. I think we just have to think about kind of what it is that literary studies can bring to the modern student, and it's not necessarily what it was.
Yeah, I think your take is really interesting in terms of like focusing more on the curriculum and how to maybe introduce more practical skills into it alongside like literature. And I know you focused a bit on writing, and this is, I do think this is a trend that we are seeing. In terms of other examples of, practicality, you talked about like internships, maybe, with library studies and things like that. Are you seeing also examples of such changes, or do you think that will take more time?
No, I think that's definitely a big area of opportunity. And at my last job, I was the undergrad advisor for the English department, and I would get contacted all the time by businesses who were looking for English majors because they just needed people who could write.
Mhm.
And that's a really rare skill. Like being able to be a clear and effective communicator. So we would place students in internships and in jobs doing grant writing, doing, web copy, public relations.
Yes.
You don't have to major in public relations to work in public relations.
Yes.
You have to have, good communication skills and, good understanding of what a client might need. So I feel like, there is a lot of opportunity for that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, what we're doing right now is a public relations entertainment organization. And
Yeah.
what's been exciting is that
Oh, sorry, my light went out.
no, you're fine. Ceren saw it firsthand, which is we have now interns from Stony Brook University who have worked for the podcast, but I've also connected with other podcasts and media companies who need interns. And
Huh.
what better person to know messaging and the creative arts than an English major? And
Yeah.
right, thinking outside of that box is so exciting. And I think, like Ceren said, it's wonderful to actually like now have the need for interns. Because I think I've seen with English departments, like there was never really that same emphasis on internships because there wasn't as many who were in the faculty who had outside experience. And I think what's great is now, oh, we might need, faculty who have come from different industries, who are in entertainment, who were in public relations, who can, show that expertise in the curriculum. So it's exciting to hear you see that integration happening. Yeah, it's definitely, I definitely see the way it's expanding. I'm excited about that.
Yeah, and definitely, I graduated from college in the previous century. And the college that I went to, University of Chicago, which is a great school, does not care at all. It's probably changed now, but at the time, they did not care about training people for jobs at all. So I did English major. I don't know if we even had a career office. There was never any talk about like, what are you going to do with this degree? And I ended up kind of graduating, never having put together, a resume or a job application for anything more than, working in a restaurant. And, and it was really hard. So the more that can kind of be built into like a capstone course or other types of courses, thinking about, how can you take the skills that you're learning as an English major and use those to work in corporate communications, to work as a freelance writer, to that kind of thing. It's going to just help the students really understand the value of what they're doing.
Yeah. And I just came back from a queer history conference, and what is so exciting is how much at Stony Brook and public universities, but mostly those, like you said, who have education programs, as PhD students, and part of the experience, we get to teach our own courses and build curriculum. And I was surprised how many PhD students still don't teach their own course. And I was concerned for them just because it's such an excellent resume builder and a way to communicate what you do. But yeah, I hope universities start, I'm glad that you're talking about that need for professionalization within, the English curriculum, and also why I think everyone who's in a PhD program should have to take a pedagogy course, because we learn so much, right? And like that kind of takes me to my question, which is, I went to a university called Kane in North Jersey for my undergrad, and I was one of the few pure English majors. I was around English ed majors because that is the largest, it's the largest education granting university in New Jersey. So I'm wearing my Call Me Ishmael shirt on purpose. Ceren knows I love Mark. I love tying in my fashion, but we read Moby Dick, and that's how I actually ended my capstone. Is we went through all the schools of theory and applied it to our own criticism of Moby Dick. Like, what's it like from a Marxist view, environmentalist, feminist, queer, psychoanalytic? And it was great to be around education majors because I realized, wait, this is how they're going to be shaping their high school students. This is ways they can think of it in accessible ways that, like, we were always trying to break down the jargon because the instructor knew that they would be talking to high schoolers. So, because I feel like it could also go in this other way where you start to almost isolate yourself off in the ivory tower. Like, oh, let's just keep talking in jargon. But what I'm curious about is, you talk about Frankenstein and using that as a text to apply different lenses. And I don't even know if we've talked about what you lay out so well, which is the difference between theory and criticism. Like, what really is, maybe even using Frankenstein, since that's in your text, as an example, what's, different about learning literary theory and then actually applying it to a text like Frankenstein?
Yeah, for me, the difference between theory and criticism, and this is not everyone's kind of way of making this distinction, but for me, theory is kind of a set of principles or a framework, or kind of what you bring to a text. And criticism is kind of how you put those principles and put that framework into action. So how you read a text. And the two are very interrelated, right? So if you come to Frankenstein with a background in queer theory, and you read that text, you're going to notice the homosociality, like, very strongly. The kind of, as Eve Sedgwick has laid out, you see these homosocial dynamics playing out with Victor and his best BFF, Henry Clerval, or with Victor and the monster. So the queer theory would be like your Sedgwick or Foucault or Munoz or, whoever else that you're bringing to the text. And then criticism was how you kind of apply that, how you read the text through that specific thing. So to my mind, they're really not that different. And I try to say that in the book, that there is a type of scholar, not so much today, but maybe a generation ago, who was very opposed to theory, and that say, I don't do theory. I just read books. I just interpret literature. But to me, that it's itself a theoretical framework. If you're saying, gender is not important, race is not important, politics is not important, all we care about is, the language of the text and the themes, that's formalism. That's a type of theory. So I don't make a strong distinction, but other people, I guess, would say that the difference between theory and criticism is that things that fall within literary theory really foreground some of those a kind of methodological or conceptual ideas, where an act of criticism, the methodological stuff sort of recedes into the background. And so it's much more, how do you interpret this text? What's the theme? What's the conflict? But as I say, that is itself a type of theory.
Yeah. So would it be like, just, for us all to kind of like see this in a tangible way, would it be like picking up the Communist Manifesto is the theory, right? Like, that's a theoretical text, and dissecting that and then being like, I wonder what the masses and, what is the bourgeois class? What does that look like in a Frankenstein? And who's more representative of the proletariat, like the working class? Is that would be the criticism, is your own interpretation of that?
Right. So Marxism Marxist theory can provide that framework of saying, one of the central structuring or the central structuring feature of human life is, the economic underpinnings of society and class tension. And then you get into more specific terminology about bourgeois and proletariat, or about, history moving as a dialectic. And then you take something like Frankenstein, and maybe you say the creature is the proletariat who is created out of the, Victor owns the means of production. He has created this, this entity and sees it as his servant in service of, Victor is capital. And then, the creature
and
comes
exploits
back,
the monster.
and it comes back.
But see, there we go.
on.
I love
Yeah.
that. But like, see, that's what's so fun to me is just playing around, like having students or a reader know that, right? We could just even take, because I know Ceren, we were talking about Marxist theory and she had some like questions about adding this, but I'm even just curious, like, I don't know, some really popular texts right now, like Bridgerton, for example. People are really excited to like look over all of the romance books, but like some might be like, well, wait, why would I need to like I wouldn't be using theory when I'm reading Bridgerton, but like what's something, and that, not to put you on the spot with Bridgerton, but like I will, no, but like even with gender relations, like when we're watching Bridgerton or reading it, it's so interesting because I mean, it has that Regency era, but then it brings in our 21st century ethics and race representation, and it's kind of a hybrid show. So in a way, I don't know, I would see there's so much there that people talk about. Like, I think, we all talk about theoretical issues without actually using, like always referring to it. Like, oh, it comes from that moment in so-and-so theorist vocabulary. It's just part of our conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, and definitely the thing I was going to say about kind of theory and like doing a theoretical reading. I mean, one of the pushbacks that people will give is like, well, that's not right. Like, Mary Shelley couldn't have been, saying this is a Marxist critique because Marx hadn't even written yet, right?
Yeah.
And so it's ahistorical to say so, but it's interesting. And like, it doesn't have to be, we're discerning what was the true meaning of the text. What did the author intend? Because that's really boring and that's very limiting to just say. So Bridgerton is a great example of that. I am somebody who works on Regency era fiction, and I've not read the Bridgerton books, but I have watched the Netflix show. And I know a certain type of historical purist would say, well, this is obviously anachronistic. Even, the clothing that they're wearing is the colors are so over the top, like nobody would dress like that, but it's saying something for our time. And so that's actually really valuable. And one of the things I found interesting about Bridgerton is that, and I don't know anything about the author or the books, but there's a very narrow, what I call a microgenre, a very specific type of novel that flourished from about 1808 to 1820 in England, that I call season novels. And they follow one season of the sort of fashionable calendar, and the whole novel is about going to parties and gossiping and what's everybody wearing and what sort of scandals, and they're full of divorce and people running off, and there's always scenes where they go to a party and somebody is new to the social scene, and somebody else is very knowledgeable and they're like, oh, so-and-so, well, that person cheated on their wife, and that person, is having an affair with his servant, and, this and that. And Bridgerton like follows this formula really accurately. And it's like, how was that author reading these really obscure texts from the 18 teens, or is this just happen to be that it follows it so closely? I don't know.
And that's something that, right, a critic would ask. That's the question. That's your starting point. And also, anyone who makes fun of me for watching The Housewives, here's a reason, right? Because it's about gossip and the stakes are so low, right? Like one sentence you said and that lasting a whole soap opera reality TV season. Like, why did so-and-so say that? What was their intentionality? What's the meaning? And I always love it because it actually helps with conflict resolution. But we could go on along. Ceren knows I'm like obsessed with The Housewives. Okay, but I know Ceren is like ready. She's ready.
I've only seen Salt Lake.
Okay.
But Salt Lake was very full of, a lot to unpack.
Drama.
Yeah.
But I think there is like this, I always think there's this connection between, gossip and literature narrative, that like dissecting and who said what, she said this and what happened. So it makes so much sense. Just in a different form, maybe when we watch it in like The Housewives. But because we talked about Marxist theory, I would like to ask my next question about the different editions of your book. You've added a couple of chapters for the second edition where you included Marxist theory, environmental studies, disability studies, which if I'm correct, they were not part of the first edition. I only have the second edition. So yeah.
Right, here's the first.
You are not correct.
I am not correct.
It's misleading language on the part of the Broadview marketing team. There's expanded coverage of disability studies and environmental studies. In the first edition, disability and environmental studies, I just touched on very briefly and in the same section. And there was feedback from people who'd used the textbook saying that they wanted a little more thorough coverage. And that was something I knew that I wanted to expand. The Marxist section, I didn't really change that much. And so I think there's maybe a little bit added there. Some of the other things that I added to the second edition were things that were either because like the field had changed and I knew I needed to add stuff, or because of reader response. So the other things I added a section on critical race theory, which after I had submitted the manuscript, suddenly became in the headlines. And so it was, the book was submitted before that became like a campaign slogan. But I felt, that was a good addition, because all of a sudden this phrase that was a pretty obscure field of legal study became kind of part of the national conversation. I added affect theory, which I hadn't talked about at all in the first edition. And that was something I knew was kind of an emerging field when I wrote the first edition, but by the time I got around to revising it, I really knew I needed to add affect theory. I added a section on Indigenous studies as, a separate and distinct field, not just kind of lumping it in with other ethnic and post-colonial studies, because there's a specificity to it. And all these things are pretty short sections, but they just add a little bit more. And then there's other revisions that I made throughout.
Now this is good to lay out.
Yeah, because yes, it is, like I said, because I only have the second edition, and reading the description of the book for the second edition, it did seem like, these chapters did not exist in the first one. So I was curious about, what informed the decision to include those chapters. Was it reader response, as you said? Was it, I don't know, what's needed in the field, what's emerging in the field currently? So, but that covers all of it. Thank you.
Yeah, and for the Marxist section, the thing that changed is that I moved the discussion of Karl Marx from the beginning of the chapter on politics into the chapter on the 19th century. Previously had included Marx at the start of the politics chapter, because that Marxist framework is so important for a lot of different political approaches. But when I was doing the second edition, the politics chapter got so big because of kind of the expanded nature of, adding critical race theory, adding more on eco-criticism and disability studies, that I just moved Marx back to the 19th century.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, okay, then I will just ask my last question. Do you have a favorite school of thought, literary theory framework? If so, what is it?
I mean, I have some things that I'm more strongly drawn to in terms of teaching and in terms of my own kind of intellectual interests. And then there's also the particular type of scholarship that I produce. And those things are related, but a little bit different. In terms of the theory that I love, that would be definitely the political stuff, the Marxist theory, Foucault. I had a whole class on Foucault as an undergrad, and that, Foucault has just been my guy, I just really like it. I've never been able to sell students fully. Like, I taught the full archaeology of knowledge once to a class, and they were not as into it as I was. But history of sexuality,
I find that very interesting.
But in terms of my own scholarship, I tend to be more of a sociological and book historian. So Pierre Bourdieu is a big kind of touchstone, and sociological approaches to literature definitely tie into kind of political and, Marxist things. But so the project that I'm working on now takes me away from the 18th century. I'm looking at a group of novels published from the 1950s to the early 1980s that are kind of popular espionage fiction that depicts a critical view of U.S. intelligence agencies. So there's a bunch of novels written by people who've left, the CIA or other intelligence, who are kind of whistleblowers or depicting sort of the nefarious activities that the CIA was involved in those years. And so that's really a departure for me in terms of the time period, but it's very much in keeping with my interest in kind of popular publishing practices and looking at kind of the relationship between novels and the real world. My dissertation was on historical fiction and looking at the way that novelists develop this framework for, using fiction as a way to reflect on historical events. And that's the same thing that these CIA writers are doing. Like, let's just call it a novel and then depict all this bad stuff that the CIA is doing.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
So, I mean, Ceren asked the last question, but Ceren doesn't even know this is about to happen. But Anne, if you will indulge me, I'd like to play a little theory game with you.
Okay.
Because it seems like you are really open to kind of throwing it at the wall. So because it's
my teaching style.
Yes, because it was Judy Garland's 100th birthday. And again, speaking back to my undergrad professor, Jan Balakian, when we learned I took the theory course with her, she assigned us the Wizard of Oz and approaching all different theory lenses to the Wizard of Oz. So I thought, why not just play that as our final game, which is I'm going to mention a theory and I'm curious how you would use that as a lens to the Wizard of Oz.
Ooh.
Are you ready?
Yeah, it sounds difficult.
I know this is the most organic, everyone out there. This is not planned. Okay.
I had no idea about this.
Ceren didn't have any idea, but I think we're all ready.
Okay.
So if we were going to apply, say, a feminist lens to the Wizard of Oz, where would you take that?
I mean, there's a very gendered division of labor there, that Dorothy is kind of the ingenue, the female protagonist, but then all of her like companions on the road are gendered male, right? Even though, I don't know it's a tin man, it's not a real gender, right? But he's a tin man, and the lion and the scarecrow shouldn't be gendered, but in this framework they are. And then all of the villains are female, that kind of, the witches. I mean, there's some good witches too. But the main antagonist is female. So I think you could do a reading looking at kind of the gendered division of labor.
Yeah, no, this is good. Now, how about a psychoanalytic reading?
Ooh, you probably focus on the wizard there, right? Projection and kind of overcompensation, maybe. Maybe has a kind of feelings of insecurity that are masked by that. But you could also definitely go into kind of questions of the id and kind of the maybe the flying monkeys are the kind of unconscious desires kind of coming to the surface. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and I know Ceren got it out of you that Marxism and political theory is one of your wheelhouse to delve into. So I don't know, Marxist theory in The Wizard of Oz.
I mean, there you might do a historical kind of reading, because the source text, the Baum novel, is an allegory for the gold standard, right? And, Follow the Yellow Brick Road is kind of stay on the gold standard. So then maybe a Marxist reading could look at that economic framework, and how that had shifted at the time that the film adaptation is done, in terms of thinking about, debates about the gold standard were not central to 1930s economic thinking, but the Depression had just ended, and kind of thinking about what economic forces are kind of central to thinking about the text. I would also, as a sociological kind of Marxist theorist, one of the things I'm most interested in is stuff kind of beyond the fictional frame. So looking at kind of, how was this film marketed? How, what was its impact in terms of, cinematic history, and, why was it the most successful film, of its time? And, why was it such a big, because it's a really weird movie.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
well, and I think, and that was incredible. I mean, but see, my whole point is we could play these games all day, but we're not going to hold you to midnight. But I think, right, this is kind of like a literary parlor game. Just pick a movie, pick a text that a lot of people know, and just, right, see like the different lenses. But this is why I want everyone, and, Ceren can hold up the second edition, but please get Literary Theory and Criticism by Anne H. Stevens, published by Broadview Press. It is, like we've demonstrated, and Anne, you got us to so many different points, which is, it's great for instructors. It's great for undergrad, grad students, the public to just, we're using theory all the time without us even, being conscious of what we're doing. So I love that you start to break down that process for us in such an accessible way. So I know I'm going to have this on my bedside table, at my office, but my bedside office table. So it's a wonderful text to constantly refer to. Thank you, Anne Stevens, for an excellent interview.
Thank you both so much. You're a great podcast host, and this is really, really fun.
It was really fun. Yes.
Very fun. Very fun.
You make it even more accessible through your explanations, and it was a pleasure listening to you. Thank you.
Yes.
You.
And all instructors, educators, students, just lovers of literature out there, because I know you're all out there. This is definitely such a great entryway into literary theory. So, start here and then go to the book. Okay. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone out there.
Bye.
Bye, Anne.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Welcome to the fall season. The Ivory Tower Boiler Room is a public humanities podcast where we interview writers, scholars, performers, and artists. Episodes air on Mondays. I am Andrew Rimby, the executive director. I'm so happy to welcome my team, Mary DePippi, our chief contributor, Kimberly Dallas, our editor, and an amazing fall group of interns. Thank you to this team. Please follow the Ivory Tower Boiler Room on TikTok and Instagram at Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Easy to remember. Our Twitter is at Ivory Boiler Room. And we have a whole new design for our Patreon. It is called the Ivory Tower Boiler Room Cafe because you're joining us and eavesdropping on our conversations that are unedited videos of all of our Ivory Tower Boiler Room episodes, as if you're eavesdropping in a cafe, overhearing the conversation. Well, talking about overhearing a conversation, hi, Mary.
Hello, Andrew, and hello, everyone. I'm Mary DePippi, the host of True Crime in Academia, a true crime podcast that is focused mainly on the crimes committed by and to those in the field of academia. Episodes air every Tuesday at noon. You can follow True Crime in Academia on Instagram and TikTok at True Crime in Academia and on Twitter at TC in Academia because Twitter hates extra characters, as we all know. And as Andrew alluded to earlier, we have a Patreon, and True Crime in Academia has exclusive bonus episodes for subscribers. As a true crime enthusiast, I don't necessarily like to pigeonhole my true crime interests. So over on the Patreon, I cover some of the more high profile cases not related to academia, such as the murder of JonBenet Ramsey and the case of Casey Anthony. So if you want access to videos like that, go over to patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room and become a subscriber.
Thank you all for joining us. And here's to an amazing fall season. Bye, Bye everyone.